So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's Southern California program.
Yay.
For the new year, right? Welcome to 2024. Happy New Year. Tonight's program is titled King Citrus, Collecting and the Dream of California. And thank you all for joining us at Pasadena Heritage's beautiful Blinn House. We love having our programs here, and we love that you've joined us. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and I'm the lucky one who gets to MC these events on a monthly basis and see you all. For those of you that are new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books, a scholarly journal called the Quarterly Newsletter, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, you should be. Or if your membership has lapsed, you should renew it. Or if you're just interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but our benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join, to donate, to get more involved in everything we do. So now, let's get to the show. Our program tonight is titled King Citrus, Collecting and the Dream of California. And our speaker is collector, historian, and author David Boulé. Now, David is a third-generation Californian with family history in both southern and northern parts of the state. He has a lifelong fascination with the history, the culture, achievements, and uniqueness of the Golden State, probably like many of you. For decades, he scoured paper ephemera shows, flea markets, antique stores, the internet, libraries, museums, and bookstores to collect items and information relating to California citrus industry. His career in marketing communications gave him particular interest and insight into how the orange helped enhance the popular image of California as a place of plenty, potential, and personal opportunity. Now, David has been profiled and his collections featured on KCET, in the Los Angeles Times LA Magazine, and on KPCC. His book, The Orange and Dream of California, was published in 2014 by our good friends at Angel City Press, and it is available here tonight in the back of the room if you're interested in adding that book to your collection. In 2017, David donated his collection of California citrus materials to the Claremont College's library. The Claremont College's library is an institutional member of the Book Club of California. In 2018, David was awarded LA Subject's Avery Clayton Spirit Award in recognition of his passionate dedication and enthusiasm in bringing LA history to the world. Tonight, he will bring that enthusiasm to a book club audience and talk about King Citrus, collecting, and the dream of California. Now, if you have any questions for our speaker, please wait until the end of the presentation. We should have time at the end, and we'll take questions then. So now, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the microphone our speaker, David Boulé.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Kevin, for that great introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming out on a chilly Southern California evening. It's my pleasure to be here. Really honored to be at the Book Club of California meeting and to meet all of you. Let me see. Does work. Okay. I have what I call the collector's gene, And that means that when I see 3 of almost anything, it starts to look really interesting. And and because of this, I've started or thought about starting many, many collections. And the California orange is the one that stuck. Decades ago, a friend of mine, who was a graphic artist, asked if I wanted to travel with him to San Diego to a paper ephemera show, something that I had never heard of at the time. And if you've never heard of them, although I bet everyone in this room has, it's a place where dozens of dealers sell thousands of pieces of paper that were never meant to survive. Napkins, menus, posters, postcards, pamphlets, receipts, brochures, maps, stickers, decals, and much, much more. I was smitten. For someone with the collector's gene, this was wonderful and was overwhelming. Where to start? What to pay close attention to? What to buy and to own? Well, as my friend looked for items that he needed to use as reference for a project he was working on, I started to entertain myself. Lost in Wonderland, I spent hours thinking up subjects and then finding files of postcards on them. Name a subject, and there have been postcards produced about it. Any subject. At the end of the day, I walked away with 2 postcards, just 2. Each one had a version of the same image. A spectacular sky, snow-capped mountains, a lovely home, and miles of manicured orange groves. A 3rd-generation California, I love these idealized Arcadian depictions of the Golden State. Well, as I have shared with you, I have the collector's gene, and that meant that when I had 2 California orange postcards, I wanted 4. When I had 4, I wanted 8. When I had accumulated 8, I wanted all of them. So I started seriously looking, and 2 things happened. The first is that the more I looked, the more I found. Some of these images appeared regularly, some seemed rare, and then they'd show up in bunches. And just when I might entertain that I had everything ever produced, I'd come across something that I never had seen after years of looking, through hundreds and hundreds of cards. For someone who is driven to, quote, have them all, finding a card like that, one that I couldn't imagine existed, added fuel to the fire to keep up the hunt. Second, I discovered that when you get really close to a subject, you begin to see things, patterns and meanings and connections. Some are superficial, but some can be meaningful, and I was amazed and intrigued. First, I noticed that so many varieties had been produced. It made sense that a company would produce postcards with attractive images of blossoms, colorful fruit, and beautiful landscapes. But why did someone think that there was a market for images of people standing on ladders? Or in a warehouse putting oranges in boxes? And on top of that, why did the companies that produce these cards think that the market would support more than a dozen variations of such images? Second, I was intrigued that people would buy and send images of people working at seemingly tedious or demanding jobs. I discovered that anything to do with California's romanticized citriculture was of interest to the rest of the country. And lastly, I was can't make this stuff up. And lastly, I was amazed that the cards, and not just the pretty ones, were kept and kept for many, many years. These images resonated. They touched people, moved them, and made them want to hold on to these images of life among the oranges. Eventually, I collected about 500 California orange postcards. One celebrating orange shows and festivals, orange blossoms, and just oranges. Many, many, many orange orchards, houses in orchards, picking oranges, fumigating oranges, packing oranges, vistas of oranges, crates of oranges, trains of rail cars full of oranges, people buying oranges, people driving through groves of oranges, and cards with fantastical or comical depictions of oranges. There were at least a half a dozen variations on "you throw snowballs for me, and I will eat oranges for you." I came to understand that collecting is about refinement. And I might have a card, but I would buy another of the exact same one if it was in better condition. Or, and this gets to the obsessive compulsive nature of collecting, if I discovered cards with a variation, I searched to find all the variations. And there were an amazing number of these. An example is in my book. There is a somewhat prosaic shot of orange trees in an orchard being irrigated. And by the way, images of orange groves being irrigated is one of my very favorites. Anyway, this image was reused over a number of years, but mysteriously modified. There was, of course, no Photoshop back then in the 1930s and 40s, but there was retouching by hand. And this particular image was retouched over and over. Clouds were added, the sky was made bluer, or a sunset was added. In some variations of this postcard, there are no oranges in the trees. And in others, the trees have very few oranges. And on others, the trees have a lot of oranges. And one version, there are so many oranges that you cannot see the leaves on the trees. One image, many variations, and used over and over for many years. I wanted every version, no matter how small the difference, until I discovered a higher calling. After our son went off to college, my wife Marcia and I were invited to a Kevin Starr lecture at the school he went to. Mr. Starr was, of course, the former California State Librarian and a superb historian, and the first words he spoke that day were, "California entered history as a myth." In that instant, my feelings about my collection changed. Up to that moment, I had been solely captivated by the postcards' images of an idealized world. I hadn't paid much attention to the backs of the cards, where once I began looking, I realized that real people wrote real expressions of what they were thinking and doing. As Mr. Starr continued to talk, my mind was racing. Were my postcards part of the myth? And what part did they play? And what stories might they tell? And what were the stories behind the images? I began scribbling my thoughts on the events program. Over the next days and weeks, I began to thinking about maybe I could tell a part of California's history in a way that others hadn't. And maybe what I had collected might have value beyond being a hobby. Excuse me. Maybe it could have value to the wider world. A private passion, but a public resource. I read Starr's books on California history. These led me to primary sources, and I began taking notes, keeping files. I broadened my collecting, looking for items beyond postcards that depicted the state's orange empire. This, in turn, led me to items that were not part of the promoter's version of California, but things that were part of the real effort and the work and the labor of the California citrus industry. And even with this revised focus and the thought of writing a book might be worth pursuing, my collection was idiosyncratic. I liked the symbolic, the emblematic, the graphic, the eccentric, the ironic, and the quirky. And I often let my collector gene take me down paths that were not useful to my newly found purpose and objective. I got fascinated with Sunkist electric juicers. And I wanted to have every model in every color ever made. I wanted to own almost any black and white snapshot I came across that showed a person reaching up to pick an orange. I looked for way too much material about the National Orange Show materials than I needed to tell the story that I was hoping to put together. One area where I did show discipline was crate labels. These are likely the most well-known part of California's citrus industry. but I realized early on that they were a rabbit hole I could not go down. There were too many, over 10,000 different ones. They could get expensive, and there were wonderful collectors and exhaustive collections that I could access when I needed. As I broadened my research and my collection, I began to get involved with organizations that were involved with preserving this area's history. The most important of these was LA as Subject, a consortium of libraries, archives, and museums. LA as Subject played a delightfully important part of my life for over a decade, and giving me a version of an encore career. And it was at LA as Subject's, annual Archives Bazaar event that I met Patty Calistro of Angel City Press, who eventually published my book, The Orange and the Dream of California. The details of that chance meeting make a great story, but it's too long to tell right now. Through LA as Subject, I met scores of people that I have come to greatly admire and sincerely like, dedicated, passionate professionals working in some of the biggest and the smallest, but all important archives, libraries, and museums in Southern California. They avidly invited me into their world, encouraged my indulgent hobby, and graciously helped me with research. They shared their knowledge and helped me take my collection of California citrus ephemera and make it into something worthy of a book, and now a donation to one of LA as Subject's member institutions, the Special Collections Department at the Claremont College's library. Involvement in LA as Subject helped me to see how a love of history and a particular perspective and the collector's gene might work together to accumulate an archive of academic value. I came to believe that a personal fascination and individual zeal had the opportunity to create a collection that is much more than a hobby or an indulgence. A person might be able to assemble materials that would otherwise be overlooked, dispersed, and so potentially never available to researchers. A passion project like this could illuminate details and discover connections that more traditionally organized collections might miss. These thoughts helped inspire my collecting. The archive grew to include historic photographs, rare advertising and marketing materials, books, newspapers and press clippings, phonograph records, sheet music, posters, journals, and personal papers, and many California-themed souvenirs and promotional items. Most of the items were found or acquired, one piece at a time, at flea markets, paper ephemera shows, and of course, on eBay. I discovered a quote recently from Alexander Gerard. He said, "A collector is an artist looking for a piece of art." I believe that. One of the things I loved about collecting is when I'd find connections. I'd find things months or years apart that connected them to each other and tell a bigger story than either individual item. Like watching a W.C. Fields movie called It's a Gift and seeing him holding a brochure on California orange groves that I or finding photographs that show Asian or Mexican citrus farm workers, Chinese, Filipino, or Japanese, and then Mexican laborers made up much of the workforce that made the California citrus empire possible, but photographs of them during the industry's glory days are difficult to find. Another remarkable outcome of all this, in addition to the book with Angel City Press, was that I had the opportunity to be profiled on a KCET program called Monomania, a show that explored a handful of people who, like me, had obsessively collected materials on a single subject. And then in 2019, I was honored to again be interviewed for a terrific KCET documentary called L.A. Foodways. Many of you may have seen that. In 1950, Los Angeles County, in 1950, was the #1 agricultural county in the country. in 1950. Now, it is the #1 food insecure county in LA Foodways explored the fascinating story of how this dramatic change happened, and efforts are underway to correct it. In my book, I tell the story of the orange in California long before they came together, and explain how these two remarkable entities were destined to make history. Cloaked in mystery, available only to the elite until modern times, the orange has been known as the fruit of gods, the food of emperors, a token of gratitude, and a symbol of health, wealth, and love. The orange is the stuff of legends. The ancients believed in the Garden of Hesperides, a grove of immortally granting golden apples, located somewhere in the far western corner of the world. California, perhaps. After completing his first 10 labors, Hercules was given 2 more, one of which was to steal fruit from this garden. The golden apples of Hesperides are often portrayed in art as oranges, and in fact, botanists classify all citrus as Hesperidia. The ancestors of all the citrus that we love today originated in Southeast Asia. Only moderate changes were required to create our contemporary varieties because citrus mutates readily and hybridizes easily. That citrus was thriving in the Middle East by the 1st century AD, as indicated by its prominent depiction on the currency of that period. This bronze coin is from the Jewish war against Rome and features the image of a citron. When Rome fell and the emerging Muslim empire brought additional types of citrus cultivation to the Mediterranean rim. In the 11th century, the Crusades brought the desire for the orange to Europe. The orange was fast garnering a reputation as special, valuable, and desirable, and not just as food, but as a symbol. French kings were determined to grow it as a status symbol and an emblem of power. The French climate was not at all suited to orange cultivation, so nobility developed glass-walled heated buildings called l'orangerie, just for growing citrus. Louis XIV had the best, of course, at Versailles. He wasn't called the Sun King for nothing. And for the next 200 years, oranges would be the exclusive property of the aristocracy and the wealthy. Then, on his second voyage to the Americas, Columbus brought with him everything needed to establish permanent settlements in new lands, including seeds for oranges, lemons, and citrons. It wasn't long before oranges and other citrus were growing wild throughout the Caribbean and along the coast of South America. In the late 15th century, Spanish author Garcia Rodriguez de Montalvo wrote a novel where the hero visits an island named for Queen Calafia, an imposing Amazon. This is what Carey McWilliams references in his 1949 book, California, the Great Exception, when he notes that there had always been something about California that incited hyperbole, and that, quote, tricks, deceptions, and wondrous visions went back 500 years and to a time before a single European had even set foot here. Franciscan missionaries arrived in Alta California in 1769, bringing with them seeds for a variety of citrus crops, and built the now fabled chain of missions. Mission San Gabriel holds the honor of having the first sizable grove of California oranges. The orchard was modest in size, but the seeds from those trees were the source of much of California's early citrus success. It took a transplant, an immigrant, as it were, to see the real promise of the orange in California. William Wolfskill left his home in Kentucky and landed in California in 1831. He planted a 2-acre orchard next to his other crops, but steadily acquired more land and planted more oranges. He recognized that the market that the gold rush was creating, and he profited by shipping his crop to San Francisco. Wolfskill became the first commercial California orange grower, and by extension, the founder of the California citrus industry. Several decades later, 2,000 rail cars of citrus were moving east annually. That's where the people were. California still had a population that was minimal. This doubled in just 5 years, and this is when the orange was still considered a luxury, affordable only to the wealthy. Many newly minted California orchardists knew very little, if anything, about agriculture. Their previous success had been in business, manufacturing, and the law. This inexperience became an asset that encouraged them to embrace new ideas when confronted with the challenges in irrigation, picking, packing, shipping, and perhaps most importantly, cooperation. By 1915, the orange industry represented a $200 million investment, and California citrus growers earned 4 times the per capita income of the average American. And by 1920, just 100 years ago, the California orange crop trailed only oil as the Golden State's largest revenue producer. For the first 100 years of orange cultivation, most California orange groves were little more than siblings of those very first trees. But in the 1870s, California nurserymen were introducing budded varieties from around the world. The introduction of what became known as the Washington navel is one of the great California stories, and it altered everything. And this might have never happened if not for a remarkable woman named Eliza Tibbets, who embodied much of what California promised and became. She was curious and a free thinker. She was both of her time and ahead of her time. She was committed to her ideals and full of contradictions. She was a doer and doing her best just to get by. Eliza married 3 times and divorced twice. She adopted an African-American child. She lived in New York City, where she was a practicing spiritualist. And she marched with Frederick Douglass in the 1871 to petition for a woman's right to vote, and attempted with her 3rd husband, Luther, to establish an integrated egalitarian community in post-Civil War Virginia. You could imagine how that turned out. All this before moving to California. Eliza and Luther were among the early Riverside emigres. When they had previously lived in Washington, D.C., Eliza and Luther had known the superintendent of the United States Department of Agriculture. Eliza wrote to him in the early 1870s asking for suggestions on what to plant on their new California property. The superintendent sent them 2 samples of a promising variety of a seedless orange that had been cultivated in Brazil. Eliza and Luther drove their buckboard 3 days from Riverside to Los Angeles to pick up the fragile trees. Eliza Tibbets is said to have watered them with her dishwater. Fruit from these trees was exhibited at the 1879 at the Southern California Horticultural Fair, where it won 1st prize. Soon these original trees became famous, important, and valuable. Eliza and Luther supported themselves for years by selling cuttings from their 2 trees at $1 apiece. And every single Washington navel orange tree in the world today is a direct, identical descendant from those 2 trees, one of which still exists and is in Riverside. A challenge arrived in the early 1890s when railroad shipping agents changed their policy and began only handling fruit on consignment. All the risk became the growers. In reaction, area growers formed a cooperative organization, the Southern California Fruit Growers Exchange, and it was immediately successful, providing its members control and stability over their production and distribution. It soon became the center of California's citrus industry. In 1908, the California Fruit Growers Exchange's pioneering advertising agency, Lord and Thomas, coined a name to use in ad campaigns. A few months later, this name was adopted for use on the exchange's highest quality oranges, and that name was Sunkist. And with that, the California orange was now a brand. Before the California Fruit Growers Exchange and Sunkist, perishable fruit had never been nationally advertised. In 1908, working cooperatively with the Southern Pacific Railroad, a train carrying exclusively California oranges was sent to Iowa. The train was decorated with banners that blared, "Oranges for health, California for wealth." That year, national citrus sales increased by 17%, but in Iowa, sales of oranges increased 50%. All the themes expressed in that very first ad, extraordinary taste, good health, smart parenting, natural purity, and real value, would be repeated and refined many times in Sunkist ads over the decades. The success of making Sunkist synonymous in consumers' minds with the highest quality created another obstacle. Some grocers removed the tissue wrappers that the Sunkist name that covered every single Sunkist orange. To give the tissue wrappers value, it developed a premium program by sending in 12 wrappers and 12 cents. A customer would be sent a silver-plated spoon. Sunkist was soon flooded with orders for spoons, a staggering total of over 5,000 a day. Customers began requesting other pieces, and the exchange responded by offering knives and forks and serving pieces. The California Fruit Growers Exchange Sunkist became the single largest purchaser of silverware in the world, buying 1 million pieces a year between 1912 and 1917. In 1952, the California Orange Growers Exchange changed its name to Sunkist Growers, Inc. It had become the most efficient marketing cooperative in the world and developed Sunkist into one of the most successful trademarks in history. In the early days of California citrus expansion, in order to give the growers a chance to compete for prizes for both their fruit and displays, regional orange shows were organized. The first of these was in Riverside in 1879, and this may be an image from that very first show. By far the most significant citrus fair began in 1911, the National Orange Show in San Bernardino. From the beginning, the show was part theme park, part trade show, part agricultural exhibition, and part theater. By the early 1920s, attendance had grown to 150,000, and the show featured thousands of oranges fashioned into, quote, a wondrous and enchanting spectacle of gold. By the late 1940s, promotional materials declared that, quote, attendance tops 350,000 annually. And this is when the whole population of Southern California, from Ventura to San Diego, was probably 1.5 million people, and there were no freeways. You can imagine what it took to drive a crude car, a Model A or something, on the roads at that time from, I don't know, Pomona to San Bernardino. I mean, you had to really want to go.
Still the same.
What's that?
Still the same.
Held in March, the National Orange Show showed off California's mild mid-winter climate and agricultural abundance to the still snowbound rest of the country. In the land of movies, radio, and eventually television, the orange had reached the pinnacle of success. The orange was a star. Another interesting aspect of California's orange industry is that a great number of groves were small, 5 to 10 acres, and were owned and operated as a supplement to the grower's full-time occupation. And while many people believed in the progressive era ideals of the times, they also had a distinctly provincial worldview. The lofty rhetoric of building virtuous, healthy, high-minded communities did not extend to the inclusion of other cultures, races, or classes. It wasn't particularly greed or mindful self-interest that fostered these views, but an us and them outlook reflective of the era that resulted in a sometimes patronizing and often exploitative approach to labor relations. This tension between the need for highly specialized agricultural labor and the challenges of growers has been a central part of California history and continues to be one of its major stories. Open up a newspaper almost any day. California citrus labor reflected the social, political, and racial attitudes of the era. Work was often segregated by gender, class, and ethnicity. Religion and class divided jobs between skilled and unskilled workers. Women most often had the job of sorting and carefully packing the fruit. And despite the great investments of time and money, the losses or failures caused by weather, ignorance, or bad luck, the big ideas that failed, the vast infrastructure required, and most importantly, the enormous amount of skilled, consistent, essential labor that was not often appreciated, treated decently, or even recognized, the poets and pundits of California refused to be swayed and continued to portray California and the life lived there among the oranges as full of beauty, abundance, health, and well-being. Well into the 1950s, oranges were still a California tourist draw, although the text in this ad from Holiday magazine also promoted Hollywood and, quote, the new steel and glass civic center. Times were changing. The Orange Empire lasted for about a century. World War II brought the end of King citrus. It offered millions of GIs a chance to see the marvels of California as they cycled through it on their way to and from war. And a great many of them came back to live in the state. The war also cemented California's place as the center of the aerospace industry and jump-started other industrial development. The people who were drawn to try their hands at citriculture had a tremendous influence on California and its image. They combined high-mindedness with ambition, conformity with eccentricity. The state continues to draw these type of people, people looking for, as Kevin Starr has described, quote, a place where human beings might break through the constraints of day-to-day life and come into possession of something immeasurably better. In 1870, a California citrus grower said, people tell large stories about oranges, but the truth is big enough. That truth shaped California in ways both significant and frivolous, and the orange became, and continues to be, a beautiful, tasty, healthy symbol, both of the fantasy and the substance of the California dream. In closing, I would like to read to you from an article entitled Paradise that appeared in the 1882 issue of Harper's Magazine. The orange grove is lovely at all times. It has a mysterious air when the long alleys are dark against the red of sunset. At twilight, the fruit glimmers on the boughs like a feast of lanterns not yet fully lit. In the free, pleasant mornings, we watch the sparkle of the yellow globes among the glossy dark leaves and catch, perhaps, the perfume of some few blossoms heralding in a new crop while the last still hangs. So thank you again for coming, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that I can. Yes?
So where do you get good oranges in LA?
I was asked that question the first time I ever gave a presentation. I think for those of us that have resources and don't struggle, we have the advantage that there are farmers markets around with, where the stuff comes that night. They drive it from the groves. It's probably most of you know, if you're Southern California natives, that we have oranges year-round because the Valencia comes to fruit in the summer and the Washington Navel in the winter. So while the Valencias are much more adaptable to juicing, we still can have oranges whenever we want.
I'm the
Yes.
backyard neighbor.
I understand before Napa Valley was the wine capital, Southern California was the wine capital of California. How did you resist going down the vineyard rabbit hole? And has anyone documented that part of SoCal?
You know, I touched on the circuitous route where simple twists of fate guided me to where I got the collection and eventually wrote the book. Early on, I'm talking shortly after the Franciscan friars came to Southern California, and when people like John Fremont and Kit Carson were coming to California, that people knew that California was an agriculture powerhouse. They just didn't know what they should grow. And all kinds of things were tried, kiwis and wheat, but lots of things stuck. But the orange was a significant one. Oh, this is good, yes?
What is your favorite fruit to eat?
Say that again?
What's your favorite fruit to eat?
An orange. Apples are just things, you know, to keep the doctor away, but oranges are great. Yes?
How much did it cost to buy an orange in New York in 1880, 1890? I've never heard anybody say what they sold for, like in New York.
That's a wonderful question. I don't know.
I don't know either.
Yeah, you know, I'm old enough to know that when I got Christmas stockings as a child, there would be some nice things in there, but mostly there was a giant navel orange at the bottom of the stocking. It was still special enough that it could become a treat. Yes?
In your collection, you had a photograph, and there was a record on it. What's on that record?
Was it an orange record or a black and white record, or a black record?
Black record.
There were a number of, oranges were such a big darn deal in the teens and 20s and 30s that there were a number of songs about oranges in California. And I can't remember the title of that, but I had, not surprisingly, I had a number of 78 RPM records with different songs on them. And lots of sheet music. I must have had a dozen, 15. Yeah. The orange record, the orange record was a promotional item that was for the National Orange Show in the 1940s. Yes?
Have you ever publicly displayed your postcards or ephemera?
Many times, yes. I don't own them anymore, but I had displayed them here or there. And then when the Claremont College's library took them, they did 2 different exhibits in their lobby. It was nice. Yes?
Yes, what is the current structure of the industry, and does Sunkist still have a piece of it?
That's an excellent question as well. Orange growing in California is just a shadow of what it was, although up in the, Marcia, what's that community? Porterville. Up in Porterville, which is kind of mid-state, right at the Sierras, still a lot of orange growing up there, but much of the growing of Washington navels has moved to Arizona and other places. Although there's a great quote, John McPhee, many of you may know him, a wonderful essayist. He had a book called Oranges, and he said that Florida may grow 10 times as many oranges as California, but California oranges are 10 times more beautiful. Sunkist had a beautiful Art Deco building right across from the LA Central Library in the 30s. Then they sold that, they moved to Sherman Oaks. They had an unusual reverse pyramid building. And now they're somewhere else, and I don't know where they are.
Valencia.
Valencia, thank you, makes sense. Yes?
So I saw that heart-wrenching image of them tearing that tree out, right? But in the backyard of both of our homes around LA are very old citrus trees. I have 3 Meyer lemon trees that are enormous, they go above my. How, did they save many of them, or have you any
You
information?
have, you're lucky to have what probably are remnants of a commercial
An
orchard at one
that
time.
I think they
Yeah, it's
built my
probably
house
benign
on.
neglect that sometimes when housing developments were made, that they would leave oranges in the backyards, but
Yes.
mostly they were just. But
Because I'm
I mean,
really
we
like-
all drive around. You can drive Orange County, Riverside, anywhere, and you'll see these trees
Uh-huh.
that are just laden with fruit, especially lemons, and nobody's paying any attention to them. They're not taken care of.
I actually I had someone knock on my door and was telling me that there's a chef who is going around West Los Angeles to help people understand that the fruit that's on their, in their garden is actually good to eat. And so I know this, but I was willing to join them and help others.
Yes,
pick their
there is
fruit
a
and
wonderful
eat it.
organization called Food Forward. You can find them online. They started 15 years or so ago, and they've gotten huge doing good work. And the way they got started is they asked people like you who have citrus trees or anything growing in their yard, when you can't use it all, to call them. They'll come get it, and they give it to people who need it. Yes?
I grew up in Southern California, and was renting a room to a woman from Paris, Sorbonne graduate, worked at JPL. And she would go out to the orange tree in the backyard, and it was so exotic to her to be able to squeeze her own orange juice. I mean, it was like, oh my God. She'd write home about it, and we just ignore them. There's so many of them, they're all over the place.
I had a fairly large collection of snapshots of people doing just that. They would be standing by a tree and they'd be reaching up with an orange in their hand and beaming. They were just ecstatic that they could be. And then often behind them you would see snow-capped mountains. And, people couldn't believe it. Yes?
In the illustration on the screen, and certainly in the illustration of the bride and the silverware promotion, there are orange blossoms. And for a long time, orange blossoms, I know, were part of bridal bouquets, bridal. Do you know how that tradition started? I don't think it was unique to California, but.
I think I showed it in my talk. It's the image for the first chapter, and it's Botticelli's Primavera.
Yes.
And he has both orange blossoms and fruit, and I think it's symbolic of both fertility and fertility and then the result of fertility. You have the blossoms and then you have the fruit.
And they smell good.
And they smell good. Yes.
Speaking of fertility, if you have a neglected citrus in your backyard, has it in it, and the fruit is bitter, try fertilizing your tree, and you will find next season it is ridiculously more sweet.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Let's take one more question if we have, Elizabeth.
Oh, I'm just tying in with something that someone else asked. But years ago, there was an organization called Rhapsody in Green, and they had a list of volunteers. I was one, so they would call every now and then. And what they did was to go to these relict orange and citrus groves out in the valley or other places. Maybe beside someone's home, there would be a couple of rows. They were obviously rows. Pick those and then take them to food banks.
Yes.
And I just wonder if you know of anything like
Yeah,
that.
that is what Food Forward does, and you can find them online. They accept donations of food, they accept monetary donations. They've grown remarkably. They have a fleet of trucks now, they have staff. They do fantastic work.
They need to come to my house for my lemon tree. It's out of control, my lemon tree. If anybody wants lemons, I have a hookup for that. Can we have a big round of applause for us? So thank you again to our speaker, David Boulé. This is the book. It is available in the back. This is my copy. I need you to sign it before you leave. So big thanks to Dave and to Angel City Press, our presenting program partner in the back there. And thank you all for attending as well. Please join us for our next program. It's actually going to be on Wednesday, January 17th at 6 o'clock. This is in San Francisco, but you can join us on Zoom. It is a program titled The Newly Discovered Notebook of Isaac Newton. And it's taught by Pern and Ward librarian at Peterhouse, University of Cambridge in the UK, Scott Mandelbrot. It's going to be a great talk, so if you can join us on Zoom, please do.
What would location be?
This is at the book club, 312 Sutter Street is our club rooms. So if you're in San Francisco and want to join us at the book club's headquarters, 312 Sutter Street, 5th floor, free, open to the public. So please join us either on Zoom or in person if you can. You can register for that book online or in any of the emails that you might be getting from the book club. You've also got a program calendar on your table so you can see all the book club programs for the first quarter of 2024, January, February, and March. So thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I hope you pick up the book in the back as well. And I look forward to seeing you again at another program here in Pasadena. Thanks everyone.